Today we're really grateful for Mr. Russell Ramsland Jr. to be our speaker today. He's an entrepreneur with a wide-ranging background. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Duke University and an MBA from Harvard. Now, since we've heard a lot about these Harvard graduates in the last week, I'm not sure that's an honor, but we will honor you, okay? He worked on Capitol Hill for U.S. Representative George Mahon. I hope most of y'all remember Mr. Mahon. He was active in the Reagan presidential administration and worked with the Reagan White House on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Russell's involvement in the SDI project involved a partnership he forged with MIT and NASA. They used that to develop an extremely advanced radiation-hard semiconductor materials initially based on the space shuttle. I hope he'll explain some of these terms to us so we will understand what he's really talking about today. He is in a number of business ventures. He's been in oil and gas production, commercial real estate development, and other operations. He is the chief financial officer of the Sandstream Communication and Entertainment, the first IP-based, fully integrated broadband communications entertainment company. He has many other things on his resume. I'm not going to enumerate them right now, but let's give him a great East Texas grassroots welcome. Russell?
You know, I'm originally from Midland, and when I got home from business school, my biggest business challenge was to convince everyone I was not a communist. I'm gonna make a mistake right now as a speaker. I'm going to apologize at the very beginning for my voice. I was invited to go pheasant hunting in South Dakota. I went up there. It turned out to be SEAL Team 1 training, thinly disguised as pheasant hunting. We hunted pheasants for 4 days in minus 15-degree chill factors with blowing horizontal snow. This is not Ebola you hear in my voice today, and if I start hacking, it's not Ebola. It's simply pheasant's revenge. Okay. Now, I thought about what to call this today. You know, Joanne Fleming has her deal, and she calls it the Life, Liberty, and Property Tour. And given that you're having lunch and the sort of grimness of what I'm going to tell you about, this might be called the Fear, Horror, and Indigestion Tour. But we'll see how this all works out here. All right, now I'm told, here we go. This is a presentation that really comes about as a result of some collaboration I've done with Frank Gaffney and Michael Del Rosso. Frank Gaffney, as you may know, was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security in the Reagan White House, and then later for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy. He later founded and is currently the president of something called the Center for Security Policy. Michael Del Rosso is a senior fellowship person at the Center for Security Policy, and he is also a senior member of the IEEE, and he was the past chairman of the IEEE's Critical Infrastructure Protection Committee. So these guys are deeply involved in what's called electromagnetic pulse and really what it means to us. It's a relatively unknown deal. You probably didn't go home and, cheerfully look at the kids or grandkids and go, so how do you feel about electromagnetic pulse today? That's not really a dinner time topic too often. How did I get involved? Well, as part of the introduction, back in the early 80s, I got a call from George Keyworth, who was the President Reagan's science advisor in the White House, and he wanted me to head up a private initiative to develop what are called radiation-hard semiconductors. And the reason for that is that whenever you have a nuclear explosion, it puts out waves of subatomic particles. pulse. And these waves come in 3 different flavors, E1, E2, and E3. And what they really do is that they just wipe out anything that's based on solid-state electronics. So that your car, of course, is based on solid-state electronics. This microphone is, all the power in this community is. Everything is dependent now on solid-state electronics. In the Reagan White House, they took this problem very seriously because obviously a nuclear device exploded over America or anywhere around was going to create a huge problem, and we're going to talk about that a lot more in a minute. But even more so, our military was based on solid-state electronics. Now, ironically, the Soviets' military still was based on vacuum tubes. It was because they were a little old-fashioned and way behind us technologically, but it also was because vacuum tubes are not subject to EMP or electromagnetic pulse. Now, I'm going to refer to electromagnetic pulse here today as EMP. That's the general way that it is known. So let's kind of dive in here a little bit and talk about what this is. When you start talking about electromagnetic pulse, you're really talking about 2 topics. You're talking about the United States power grid, and you're talking about EMP really as a threat to that grid. And you'll see why we split it up here in just a second. Let's just have a little overview of the U.S. power grid. Basically, there are 3 sectors in the U.S. power grid. There's the Eastern Interconnect, which you see right here. There is the Western Interconnect, and then there is the Texas Interconnect. And these are the 3 major components of the power grid. There is some slight connection between these 2 and between these, but not a great deal. Let's talk a minute about electromagnetic pulse. There are really 3 areas of electromagnetic pulse to be concerned about, and we're going to talk about these only insofar as you'll understand the problems with weather, and you'll understand the problems with a nuclear blast. Electromagnetic pulse E1 generally comes from a nuclear blast, what's called high electromagnetic pulse environment. E2 really generates more often from lightning, although a nuclear blast does give you some E2 pulses. And E3 comes normally from nuclear blasts or from geomagnetic storms, which you and I would know as solar storms. Now, E1 is a very fast pulse. It comes off very, very fast, near the speed of light. These particles come out. The second wave has a longer wavelength. It's a slower pulse. And then the third one is a very low frequency, very long pulse. It can last for literally tens to hundreds of seconds. So we have 3 very different sort of waves here that we're going to talk about. But before we talk about these, let's back up a minute. If you recall, I said we're going to talk about the grid as well as electromagnetic pulse. And the reason we're going to do that is because, you see, the grid has other enemies besides just electromagnetic pulse. And as we get near the end of this, you'll understand why I want to talk about this. First one is physical attacks. Now, I don't know, but you all may have read about, in April of 2013, there was a very, very sophisticated attack that was launched on a facility out in California, Pacific Gas and Electric Facility. It was a substation. And it was very, very sophisticated because not only had they scouted what they thought were all the power cables that underground reported what was happening in this substation, but they had sent people out, whoever attacked it had sent people out in 1s and 2s and 3s over what they now believe was a period of 4 months to scout the exact rifle shot positions that the shooters needed when they were going to make a physical attack on this thing. And they did it just like the SEALs would. I mean, they would go out and they would find the exact spot, and they would just make a little stack of about 4 rocks. And they would locate that on the map so that then the shooters would know pretty much where they needed to go, and then they'd find the rocks, and then they shoot, and then they leave. Now, what actually happened in the event? We'll talk about that more in a minute. Cyber attacks, of course, are when they break in and work on the software, and we'll talk about that. Then there are weather attacks, and then, of course, there's EMP attacks. So we'll kind of go through this. This was the attack I was telling you about, Pacific Gas and Electric. It really started when this person entered the underground vault to cut the telephone cables. There were more than 100 shots fired by the various riflemen in there to shoot down the transformers. And the lucky thing was that whoever planned and cut the underground cables, and by the way, going into a manhole and cutting underground cables is no trivial job, they missed one. And with that one they missed, we got an early warning that there was something seriously wrong there. And fortunately, the attack happened at night. The other reason that that was good is because we couldn't get that substation up running again really for months. But we were able, during the night when the power requirement was low, to get surrounding substations to reshunt their power in so that Silicon Valley didn't go dark. But that's really what this was all about. FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, senior officials basically said or concluded that of the 3 electrical systems that serve the nation, the Western Interconnect, the Eastern Interconnect, and the Texas Interconnect, if as few as 9 of the substations were knocked out, the entire country could go dark. Now let's just think about that for a minute. The entire country could go dark. What does it take to get that back? We're going to talk about that, but you will see that we are talking about years to get that back. And how long will this civilization last without air conditioning, without food, without gasoline, without heating, without television, without communication? This is a civilization-ending event. The fear, horror, and indigestion tour. Cyber warfare. In fiscal 2014, there were 79 hacking incidents at energy companies that were investigated by the Department of Homeland Security. And between April 2013 and April 2014, the hackers managed to break into 37% of these energy companies. Now, energy companies aren't talking about what these hackers did. We don't know if they just went and put malicious software, embedded malware into the control sections. We don't know exactly what they did. You know, some of y'all may remember we went in with the Israeli intelligence people and we embedded their nuclear effort with what was called the Stuxnet virus. And that was a very clever virus because it was very hard to detect. And the reason it was is that it would start spinning the centrifuges at speeds that would destroy them. But it was also programmed to start reporting to people who were watching the centrifuges that everything was normal. It was a very, very clever virus, and it really, really set back their effort for a while. Well, we don't know exactly what these 37% of break-ins did, and the electrical companies aren't talking about it. But clearly we now have a physical presence and a threat. We have a cyber presence and a threat. Let's talk about the weather one. This is the approximate size of the Earth. This is the sun, and this is what's called a coronal mass ejection, or CME, or solar flare. If nobody attacks the grid, the sun will. It already has. If you go back well, excuse me. This sort of gives you an idea what happens. There's a huge solar flare. It sends out all the particles, and generally these turn out to be mostly E3 long-range particles. And what they do is they come down and they massively energize anything that looks like an antenna to it, which in our case is power lines. So what does that really do? Well, the Carrington event of 1859 was a pretty good example. There was a huge solar flare then. It came down, it nailed all the telegraph lines. Those telegraph lines became highly, highly energized by this particle wave. People in telegraph offices, literally, some of them were blown right off their feet because the power came in, it ignited the telegraph machines themselves. Some of them tried to unplug their telegraph machines from their battery source. It didn't matter. The power coming in off the lines now was so great. The telegraph machines burst into flames. It was a huge problem. And really, that's the same sort of problem we would face today if we had a huge solar incident, in that it would come into the lines, into all of our substations around the country and into houses, et cetera, et cetera. So, they estimate today that about $1 million to $2 trillion during the first year alone would be a reasonable estimate of what would happen for a geomagnetic storm, and it would take somewhere between 4 and 10 years to fully recover from that. We'll see why that is. But the problem is not a theoretical one. In July of 2013, there was a huge solar flare. Now, the really good thing is it happened about a week too early. In fact, if it had been, had the storm occurred a week earlier, it would have been a direct hit on us. And we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it didn't. It was just a week off. But there have been other smaller solar flares. For instance, in Quebec, we'll talk about that, I think. This just gives you a little data about really how often you should think about or expect these things. Quebec had one in 1989. 6 million people were out of power. Fortunately, they were only out of power, as far as they know, for 9 hours. It actually took about 2 years to restore the Quebec system. We shunted power from the Eastern Interconnect up there to keep Quebec from literally going into chaos. So the entire U.S. population is really at risk from a Carrington-like event. They tend to be about 100 years apart in various durations. And so if you do the math, you kind of come up to somewhere between 2020, 2030, we'll be overdue. But enough about the happy news on the weather. Let's talk about our good friends in Iran. Now, the Iranians, of course, are pretty dead set on establishing Sharia worldwide. They not only want to wipe out the little Satan, which is Israel, but they want to wipe out the great Satan, which we have the dubious honor of carrying that moniker. And they're really hoping of death to America all over again. The Revolutionary Guard's slogan will once again come worldwide, and this is really their goal. And they've been very, very, very clear about it. The previous president, Ahmadinejad, said, "A world without America is not only desirable, it is achievable." And if you don't believe that statement, stay tuned. You see, that ambitious goal could be achieved by using some of the various forces over there, Hamas, the Hezbollah, the Quds, etc., through just a physical act of terrorism, through cyber warfare aimed at, our banks, our military, the grid, or even a, nuclear attack and a suitcase bomb in a city. But that won't really do it. And there is another possibility that is practical, it's highly cost effective, it's very near term, and it possibly leaves no fingerprints pointing to them. And that is a high altitude EMP event over the United States. What does that mean? Well, in this particular illustration, you see, here we go. Here's Texas and Florida and the East Coast, etc. This happens to be Ohio. In fact, it happens to be Cincinnati, Ohio. And if you blew up a nuke 600 miles, the atmosphere 600 miles above Cincinnati, this is the area that EMP wave could hit. That's the entire Eastern Interconnect. That's 200 million people. That's 200 million people, most of whom will not have enough gasoline in their car to drive to somewhere where there is power. That's 200 million people who will not see power. We're not talking weeks and months, we're talking years. Is that hard? Not really. Scud in a tub is what the DOD calls it. And in this particular scenario, you have your familiar tramp steamer, you have your very familiar Scud ballistic missile launcher, and you simply put it on the deck inside a container. You cruise into the Gulf of Mexico, you open the doors, and you blow it off. How many people here realize we have no south-facing radar in this country? The point I'm trying to make to you is that we are not defended. Ever since the Reagan folks got out of the White House, from George Herbert Walker Bush forward, we have shut down the idea of defense from ballistic missiles. We have the Aegis system, which works for ships, and we have a little bit of it on the East Coast and a little bit of it on the West Coast. We have, of course, been critical in the Iron Dome project, but none of those have the capability to intercept a missile high over a country. And remember, this illustration I gave you over Ohio is 600 miles up in the air. It could explode and still create the problem. So, is it any real surprise that the Iranians now are working on ballistic missile technology, obviously getting a nuke, and obviously beginning to work with Korea, etc., on sea lanes, and of course, tramp steamers are everywhere. Now, it was very interesting because you probably remember last year there was a report about a North Korean ship passing through the Panama Canal. And in the hold of it, under a load of sugar, about 10,000 tons of sugar, were 2 SA-2 missiles. Those are ballistic missiles. And the intelligence people believe that it was a dry run. It was simply trying to determine if you could get a missile undetected through the Panama Canal. And in fact, they were going from east to west. The next drill would have been from west to east, and they probably would have been live missiles. So this is not some theoretical deal. And all the intelligence agencies in this country were absolutely on red-hot alert when this event happened. You saw a little bit about it in the newspaper, but probably no one explained to you that if you can use the Panama Canal to transship ballistic missiles, you can put them on a freighter, you can put them on that launcher, you can put them on that deck, and you can steam into the Gulf of Mexico. That's kind of how it all unfolds. Now, North Korea, that Iran is working with, has tested nuclear weapons. They also have what's called a super EMP design that was furnished to them by the Soviet Union. This is a a nuclear warhead that is designed not to land and explode like a conventional warhead would be, but no, it's designed to generate the maximum amount of EMP high up in the atmosphere. So is it any real surprise that North Korea is really focused on ballistic missiles at this point? The answer is, of course, no. Now, by the way, everything I'm telling you about EMP is well known. It's well in the literature. And the North Koreans know it, the Iranians know it, the Soviets know it. All the guys that don't send us Christmas cards know it. What a lot of people may not know is that the KMS-32 satellite, which is compatible with the size and the weight of a small nuclear weapon, has been practicing over the United States. And these are the satellite passes, April of 2013, that they made over the United States. This is a practice run. And by the way, there's Ohio and Cincinnati right in the middle of it. Surprise, surprise. So, there you see Cincinnati again. Now, 74.4% of the U.S. power generation capacity are these red dots. Right there. All of them within range of that blast, or a great number of them. This is right here, you see this big, huge thing? That is a voltage transformer. There's roughly 2,100 of them of that size in the United States. Every single one of them is custom made. The size, the plug-ins, the configuration, everything custom made. Takes about 2 years to produce one and about another year to transport it and get it installed. Guess how long that would take if there was no power? This is why this is a civilization-ending event. This is why this is so serious. What's amazing is that we are the only advanced nation in the world that hasn't taken steps to harden our grid. Japan has a program. Europe has a program. We don't have a program. Well, I say that. We'll talk about the program that was announced yesterday, literally. So, it is a high-altitude EMP from a nuclear weapon is the most efficient way to take out our transformers, computers, and other stuff. They could combine that with localized EMP weapons, with direct physical attacks, with cyber warfare attacks. And remember, you take out 9 substations completely, that's what FERC estimates, and the whole country goes dark. Now, you can find all this information out for yourself or verify it for yourself if you want to. These happen to be just a few of the reports. There has been a litany of them. This is not some secret. This is not a secret to your congressman, or it shouldn't be. Certainly, we have done a lot of work to try to raise the awareness, again, after many years of the problem with the grid and EMP. This is their deal. This comes right out of one of their reports. It will be impossible to remediate the effects of a prolonged blackout, whatever its cause, after it happens. Your best hope is to minimize the loss before it happens. It's a total societal breakdown. And the only way you really get around it is you prevent it from happening by making the grid resilient. Now, how can you do that? And what does it cost? Well, actually, the cost isn't all that much. That's the good news. And depending on whether you're shielding from EMP1, EMP2, or E3, depends on how you go about doing it. Heavy-duty surge protectors have been developed over the last 10 years, 15 years, that are so fast that they can react to E1, which are the very first waves that hit, and they can switch things off to help protect the equipment. In fact, today, you can buy a surge protector in your house that is fast enough to do that. They're expensive, but you can do that. And until somebody does something about the grid, good luck. You won't have any power anyway. But the point is, surge protectors for E1 are a real possibility. Capacitors can divert current. That really addresses more of the E2 issue. So that current comes in and gets diverted away. And then something called Faraday cages can be put in there, and they protect direct particle going in and direct waves going in and destroying the equipment. So there was an EMP threat commission put together by Congress. They estimated that the cost of hardening the grid, the critical transformers, the 2,100 of them, critical transformers and microcircuits, to be $2 billion. Now, we remember the stimulus, the $840 billion. Guess how many dollars went to the grid? Bingo. Not one penny. And there is new technology, as I said, that's getting better all the time that could make this a little less in cost. So what can you do and what have we done? Well, we have been seeking Governor Perry's support. We did finally about 4 months ago, get a personal meeting between Michael Del Rosso and Frank Gaffney and some other people and Perry. We have held a briefing with Dan Patrick. We have held a briefing with Ken Paxton. We have held a briefing with several of our own representatives. And Pete Sessions has become very concerned about this. And he and another guy have even started offering bills to try to do something about the grid. Now, they haven't gone anywhere. Thank you, Harry Reid. But at least there is some awareness that is starting to happen at the national level, but it needs to happen a whole lot faster. We need to get electric utilities involved. Now, the electric utilities are not exactly alacritous in wanting to go harden the grid. They think they've hardened the grid. But normally when they think they've hardened the grid, they're talking about only against electrical strikes. They're not like lightning. They're not talking about EMP. So there is some hardening going on. They have started thinking a little bit more about security. And yesterday, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued some new rules that you're going to love this. By 2016, the utilities have to come back and say, well, these are the pieces of our infrastructure that we think are vulnerable. You know, I could get Michael Del Rosso and probably in about 2 days get that done. But they have till 2016. Then they have some long period of time, as yet unspecified, to actually do something about it. And then what they decide to do about it, the government will come back, the DOD, et cetera, will come back and look at. But in the rulemaking specifically, the government doesn't have the right to force them to harden anything outside of what the utilities identify for themselves. So it's pretty weak, but it is a step in the right direction. It is a step in the right direction. It never hurts for you guys to learn the term EMP, to start talking about the grid, to start talking to your state reps, to start talking to your national reps. Keep in mind the Texas Interconnect is its own system. And if we can harden the Texas Interconnect, it's at least a great first step. We had a very interesting discussion one night with Frank Gaffney. He said, yeah, he says, that's a great thing. But he says, what's going to be your policy when 100 million people want to come across the East Texas border through Tyler because they have no lights and no food, no gasoline, and no place to live? So we really are kind of all in this together. There is a common temperature to the bath water, so to speak. But we should focus on Texas, and in doing so, just as we're doing in a lot of other political areas, we can be leaders for the country. Surprisingly enough, There are a few other states that are beginning to wake up. Maine, believe it or not, Maine now has a state law that mandates their utilities have to harden their grid. We do the same thing in Texas. But we can only do the same thing in Texas if our representatives realize we're kind of serious about this. And we're more than happy to put on a presentation for any legislators who are willing to sit down and listen. And we have done that. But we still have a lot of legislators who can't quite even remember the EMP, much less what it is. They don't understand that this is a very, very important thing. I mean, these are smart guys, a lot of these legislators. But if they've never heard of it, and they don't understand the real implication, and they don't understand even, most importantly, they don't understand that you have heard of it, and you know the implication, and it's important to you, then we won't make a whole lot of progress here. Reagan, as you all know, said freedom's never more than one generation from extinction, etc., etc. Love that guy. If you want to just get materials on it, I included this at the end. This is a website, the project for the Center for Security Policy, www.securefreedom.org. That's a great place to go. They've got all kinds of information. They also tell you what's going on in the news and things like that, and where progress is being made or not being made. And so it's a great one-stop shop. You can, of course, Google EMP and get just overwhelmed with information. You can Google EMP in the grid and get overwhelmed with information. But this is the simplest one-stop shop to start kind of getting up to speed on that. Okay. Fear, horror, and indigestion. Yes. Yes, sir.
Are you ready for questions?
Write the questions down.
I have
Uh-oh. Now we're in trouble. Okay.
No, I'm nice.
I know. It's my turn for fear, loathing, and indigestion. Go ahead.
Am I on? Okay. Being kept alive with my pacemaker. Assure me I'm not in danger from an EMP. TV writers say pacemaker wearers are dead with EMPs.
Well, probably are. The good news is that, if it's a true all-up EMP attack on an unprotected grid, that may be the quickest, most merciful way to get out of it. Actually, there are a number of things that are going on in small devices today, including your cars and including your cell phones. And that is that there is a certain amount of shielding that is starting to take place, particularly as automobiles have more and more electronics in them. The distance deal that keeps you from running over the guy in front of you, supposedly, or your own cell phone and the way it works inside the car and through the radio, the Bluetooth, etc. There's a lot more shielding going on, so you don't get an interference on your phone from your electronic ignition. And your phone is getting more shielding, and your pacemaker has to have a certain amount of shielding because you don't want it to be reacting to every transient radio wave that floats around out there. The other good news about a pacemaker, as well as a cell phone, is that they are so small that unless the EMP particles knock out the silicon in the lattice of your solid-state device, there isn't enough antenna in there to give EMP its real effect, and that is it multiplies over distances that have antennas like wires. So no one has ever tested a pacemaker. No one has ever tested a car or a car phone. All we can do is postulate. If you wanted me to postulate, I'd say you probably odds are 70-30 against you. That, as I said earlier, may not be the bad news. Whether or not a cell phone would survive or an automobile, no one has ever tested. They don't know. There's really only one EMP testing facility in the United States. I think it's in Wyoming, where they can simulate a real EMP wave.
Where?
I think it's in Wyoming someplace. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is it true that an EMP attack would take out cellular towers?
Yes.
Can you discuss the effect of HAARP regarding the grid/military use?
Well, HARP is, boy, that's a long discussion. HARP was a very high altitude project, and there is so much written about it. I am not an expert on the HARP project, and so I really don't want to get into that a whole bunch. I have read a lot of things about HARP that I know are untrue because I did just brush with it a little bit. I've also read a lot of things about HARP that I think do resonate and could be true. But it's the grid itself is vulnerable to any form of electromagnetic pulse. HARP is one of those.
Do you think Obama would sign a bill that would be a solution to this problem?
Really? Is that really the question? Only as a last resort if he thought it would buy him something that he really particularly wanted. But we haven't noticed that this guy is particularly concerned about keeping the U.S. in any form of leadership or well protected. I mean, my God, you look at what he did last night. So I wouldn't bet the ranch on that one.
Are today's civilian cars hardwired?
No, they're solid state. Civilian cars are all run on solid state electronics. So they could quite possibly have a problem if the solid state electronics are not well enough shielded. Now, they all have computers in them. In fact, you no longer have a distributor with a mechanical distributor cap and all that kind of stuff anymore. That's all solid state electronics. All of that could die depending on the amount of shielding that's in there. Let me back up. I gave kind of a fun answer to the Obama thing, but you know, it could be buried in a defense authorization bill, and Obama would sign the defense authorization bill. As a standalone bill, I wouldn't bet the ranch on it.
This is a two-part question. Is there a Texas movement to merge all 5 grids, and is this a good idea?
Is there a movement to do what?
Merge all...
Yes, there is. In fact, the United States Department of Commerce put out a deal in 2003. You can find it online. And it talks about merging the entire U.S. grid. And by the way, it also talks about smart meters. And the whole point of it is that we're going to have a single unified U.S. grid that would allow someone in Washington to decide who gets power and who doesn't. So it is out there. It is a real deal. I read the whole thing. It's really great bedtime reading. You'll sleep well. But yes, there is a discussion on doing that. Now, Texas so far has resisted. I hope it continues to resist. It's a great idea to have a little interconnection, but it's not a great idea to let those clowns in Washington have any control over our power.
Within the past month, one of our most sophisticated ships in the Black Sea with the most secure and advanced electronics went black after being buzzed by a Russian airplane. Is this new warfare by electronics?
Yes. Oh yeah, the Russians have been working for quite a period of time on high energy warfare. So are we, by the way. But I think what really caught us by surprise is that our shielding was not better. We thought we were in better shape on that than we were, and we clearly weren't.
I've heard that you can put your electronic devices, battery-powered radio, etc., in a steel trash can to protect them.
Yes, that's sort of a variation of the Faraday cage. And so, yes, you can put your computers and things like that in a trash can to protect them. Now, the only thing you have to think about is when you pull it out of the trash can, and the grid's down, did it matter?
Yeah, it's battery operated.
What are you going to connect to? There's no internet.
Radios outside the United States. I mean,
Well, that's shortwave ham radio kind of stuff. Yes, you could. That would do you some. That might do you some good. You see, and that's one of the reasons why they talk about have a portable radio, particularly a shortwave or a ham deal, because if you think about it, in an EMP attack and the grid goes down, how do you know whether the grid in Oklahoma is still up, the Western Interconnect? If it's still up, get in the car. If you got enough gas, get there. If the car will start. That's exactly right. And you don't know. Well, no, that's not true, because as I say, the shielding has been improved because now they want to have your cell phone used in there, and so your car, the shielding wasn't designed to protect from EMP. The shielding was actually designed to protect your car phone and stuff from interference about what all the cars do. But it works both ways. And so some cars may well start. Some cars may well start, but no one's ever tested that to find out.
Post-EMP survival time of insulin and other medication.
Maybe the least of your worries. I have no idea. I mean, how long does a refrigeration last? There's no power, remember.
Why was the country divided into 3 sections? Texas was such a small third part.
Well, actually, that goes way back. You know, the grids in the United States were all developed in a huge patchwork deal. If you look at the Eastern Interconnect, there are hundreds of utility companies that all sort of interconnect with each other in the Eastern Interconnect. Same with the Western, same with Texas. And so it really came about not as a really well thought out plan or design. It really came about as a result sort of the free market as it came together and worked together. And it's just turned out that it's become incredibly important. I don't even think back, we did the first atomic test and saw EMP back in the 50s in Hawaii. I think it was 1954. Could be wrong about that, but it's pretty close to that date. And that was the first time we suddenly realized what EMP was and how deadly it was. We wiped out all communications for 800 miles in any direction of that explosion. And the Texas grid really came about just as a free market conglomeration of folks working together. So did the Eastern, so did the Western. But it's the United States federal government that now wants to put it all together in a single one, and that's really kind of a concern, I think.
What is the ballpark cost to update the grid?
Well, about $2 billion has been the estimate that I believe it was the Department of Commerce thought would give us at least the major substations, the 2,100 major substations, protected. So, and it may be less than that. But the point is, at least the technology's out there, and $2 billion to these guys in Washington is just chump change. The problem you have is designing a set of incentives that don't pervert the whole process, because you have to motivate the utilities to do that, or else you have to mandate and figure out a way to pay them, and then you get into, as we all know, whenever Washington does something, kind of an interesting problem. It would be better if we could get the utilities in Texas on the Texas grid to do it. It might add, some of the estimates are it would add 20 cents a month to your utility bill. Really? That's a problem? No.
I think this is more of a statement here. Book to read. Have you read this book? 1 Second After. He doesn't remember the author, but he recommends reading it by Congress.
I know the book. I have not read it.
Okay. What about older cars? Will the classic car enthusiasts be able to continue to move about until they run out of gas?
Yeah, actually, that is the case. As long as it's before solid-state electronics. Now, your radio won't work unless you have a vacuum tube radio in your older car, but that won't matter either because the radio station won't be broadcasting. But yeah, your older cars that have a mechanical distributor and all that kind of stuff, they should survive. Maybe you should keep one in your garage. No fuel injection, carburetors.
Thank you, Russell.
All right, thank you all.